Welcome. We have here with us today Professor Thomas Adajian. I was thinking about James Young, the Canadian. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy, James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And he's here to talk to us about the pragmatic definition of art. And that's enough. You have the word.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. Art students. Okay. All righty. Okay. So I've thought about, I've been thinking about the definition of art for a long time, and I've been thinking about Peirce for a long time, but I never have put them together particularly until pretty recently. So I'm going to utter the dreaded words that nobody likes to hear at a talk. This is part of a larger project. So that's to say I've pulled a bunch of stuff out, and I'm trying to put these two streams together. So just a little bit of background on Peirce. Some of it's going to be relevant to the talk, and some of it's just background. How many folks here know anything at all about Peirce? Okay, some. Okay. Spelled Peirce but pronounced Peirce, the founder of American pragmatism. He was best friends with William James. In fact, later in his life, he adopted Santiago as an added middle name because he thought so highly of James. Dewey was his grad student, or at least in the grad program when Peirce was teaching. Relevant. So first point, if you're interested in the history of logic, Peirce made absolutely groundbreaking contributions to the history of logic. He was actually way better known than Frege was at the time of the development of quantification theory, and Peirce and Frege did at the same time. So he did a bunch of interesting things, very interesting things, important things in logic. But more to the point for the present talk, he spent his career as a scientist, as a working scientist. He spent decades doing real science. It's kind of remarkable that for all that American philosophy prides itself on being scientific, people don't know about Peirce, and he's, I think, clearly the most scientifically accomplished of any American philosopher ever, and that's not saying much, but maybe of any philosopher in centuries. So, two things he did, among other things, he did the first experiments tying the standard meter to a wavelength of light. Before that they had there was a bar in Paris. That was what the standard meter was, and this is conceptually a huge leap. And then secondly, and this is even bigger, I think, and Ian Hacking makes this claim out in his book on probability theory. As far as people can tell, he did the first controlled, randomized, blinded experiment in the history of psychology. That's a huge methodological advance. It's absolutely huge. And his student he was working with Joseph Jastrow, if you guys know the duck rabbit from the Wittgenstein philosophical investigations, a famous duck rabbit. Jastrow was his student, and he spent years doing work on, Peirce spent years doing work on measuring gravity all over the world. So that's got some bearing on what I'm going to say here, not directly, but obliquely. So I should say first, a lot of this is really speculative. Peirce wrote almost nothing about art, so I'm extrapolating some views about art from other things he said. I just want to make the view seem worth thinking about. It's kind of a strange view in a lot of ways, but I think interesting. So I'm going to try to connect it with a couple themes in what Peirce says about definition, about natural kinds, and then I'm going to try to connect it with some issues in contemporary philosophy of art. So I'm trying to speak to two audiences here. We'll see how that goes. So I gave a version of this talk somewhere else, I talked to some colleagues about this. One of my colleagues said, for God's sake, mention the conclusions right at the start. Don't build up to the conclusions. So I'm going to give you some of the main conclusions right now, and then we'll try to get there. So the idea is that he wants to think about art primarily as a mode of life, as a kind of a practice. And that's not so unusual. What is unusual is that he thinks that the important way to characterize practices is in terms of the animating spirit of the exemplary members of that practice. So that's one big point. Second big point, he's got a theory of aesthetic goodness which is parallel to his theory of truth. And I'll say a little bit about the theory of truth, but that's interesting from an internal Peircean perspective, and it's also interesting because the view is that aesthetic good and evil are what would be pleasure and pain to a fully developed agent. And he actually uses the expression fully developed Superman, which is quite striking. I don't know whether he read Nietzsche or not. I've never been able to find any evidence of that, but I don't know where you'd get the term Superman, although Peirce was very inventive with terminology, unless you heard some Nietzsche. And then finally, he thinks that art is essentially communal in a deep way. So, some at the top there. So here's the outline. I'm going to say something about pragmatism, which is the school that Peirce founded. Then I'm going to talk about science as a mode of life. And then I'm going to stop for a moment and say, well, is this stuff about the animating spirit of a practice even plausible at all? Is it plausible? Because if it's not plausible, I'm just making a historical point, and I'd rather make both a historical point and a point that was philosophically interesting. So I try to argue that it is independently plausible. Then I'll talk about art as a practice in some detail, quite a number of points there, and then time permitting, I'll compare Peirce's, what I take to be Peirce's view with a handful of contemporary views, and suggest that it comes out looking better than the contemporary views. So does this make some kind of sense? Is a plan here? Well, let's hope so, because it's what we're doing. So, on pragmatism first. What is pragmatism? Peirce called pragmatism a laboratory philosophy. He spent his life in laboratories. And it's a method for figuring out what concepts mean. The fundamental idea, arguably, is that you analyze concepts in terms of experimental consequences. How do they bear on conduct? So, the thought is anything that could bear on conduct could result from experiment, and so the meaning of any concept is completely exhausted by an account of all the conceivable experimental consequences. So that's pretty abstract. I'll give you an example in a second. Peirce says, to build up to that last point, we can achieve 3 grades of clarity with regard to our concepts. The first grade of clarity is where we can just identify something as an instance of the concept or not an instance of the concept. So this thing is a diamond, is really what I want here, and rather, or this thing is not a diamond. That's a diamond, this is not a diamond. Second grade, we can give a verbal or nominal definition. We can say hardness is resistance to abrasion. Third grade, we can say something like, if anybody were to try to scratch this thing, then it would resist that attempt. So those are experimental consequences. Take the thing, do something with it, see what happens. That's the fullest understanding of what it means for something to be hard, is that if we perform a certain experiment on it, certain results will follow. That's what it means to be hard. Peirce thinks there's nothing more than that it could mean to say something's hard, than that if we were, and not necessarily if we do, but if we were to perform the experiment, then we would get certain consequences. Maybe the experiment's never performed, but it still can be the case that if we were to perform it, we would get certain consequences. So far, so good? Okay. So it's important the first 2 grades of clarity are important. We want to be able to tell the diamonds from the things that aren't diamonds. But the worry at the second level is we're defining one word or concept in terms of a bunch of other words or concepts, and so we never touch the real world. And that's no good. That's no better than a dictionary definition where we get one word defined in terms of another and then a second defined in terms of the first. We're stuck in a circle. So here's an application of the pragmatic idea that I'll refer to at least illustratively later. Remember, the second grade of clarity is the nominal definition, just verbal. Second grade of clarity, definition of truth. Truth is correspondence between a proposition and what it's about. Well, that's fine. That's fine, but it's all words. What's correspondence anyway? How do we understand that? Peirce's thought that the third grade of clarity is, what could it possibly mean in terms of possible experience for a proposition to be true? What it would mean would be, if we took a community of inquirers and we let them inquire for as long as they wanted, if they ended up with the belief that P, then P would be true. There's nothing more that it could mean to say that something's true than that. The ideal community of inquirers would settle on that at the end of inquiry. Anything beyond that would be just words, just inaccessible something or other, a thing in itself. So that's the third grade of clarity. That's a real definition of truth, as opposed to just a nominal definition of truth. Not just about words, it's about you actually bring the world in. So, yeah.
Sorry. What does Peirce mean by ideal community of inquirers?
Okay, so consider a normal, like an actual community of inquirers.
Mm-hmm.
Their motives are not the best. Their motives are complicated. Their methods are complicated. Their knowledge is limited. Are you with me here? There's various. So jack that all up as far as it goes. The ideal community is the one that's got the purest motives, the best methods, the best background knowledge. Does that make sense?
It's like a new standard of taste.
You are a very clever man. Just hold your hold your tongue.
Okay.
It also comes from the idea of ideal spectator.
Say it again.
It also comes from the idea of ideal spectator.
Oh, yes. Right. Yep. You too. Yep. Just hold on. So as I said, Peirce says very little about art explicitly, but he does say a whole lot about science. He spent his life doing science, and he theorizes about science a lot. So the way I have built up this view, this speculative view, is to look at what he says about science and then generalize it to the case of art. And I think that's I'm actually quite convinced that that's a reasonable tack. So science is a mode of life adhered to by people whose single animating spirit is to find out the truth. It doesn't consist in organized knowledge, it consists in inquiry for truth's sake. Okay? No axe to grind, not for the delight of contemplating truth, but for the desire of finding out the truth. Period. Crucial claim, probably the crucial claim in the paper. Peirce says it makes no difference how lousy your knowledge is, it makes no difference how lousy your methods are. From the moment that you're engaging in inquiry, in that kind of spirit, what you're doing is science. So this is not a standard view. But everybody with me here so far? We've got the mode of life, we've got the animating spirit. The animating spirit is what does the work as I read this. So as a mode of life, science comes with characteristic virtues, as does any mode of life. So what are the characteristic scientific virtues? Curiosity, obviously that's part of the animating spirit. I quoted some stuff from Richard Feynman, the famous physicist who was very much speaking in a Peircean spirit here. Peirce says a scientist who's not really ready to dump all of her theories immediately when she finds out that they're wrong is not, to that extent, fully worthy as a scientist, let's put it that way. The concern for truth, if you think about the ideal community of inquiry, which is the way we get to truth, and Peirce has a long story about this, but the motives of the scientist have to involve this altruistic identification of his or her interests with the interests of the whole community. Like, I may not get to the truth, we may not get to the truth for generations, but what I have to identify my own intellectual interests with the ultimate community, the community along the way, getting closer to the truth. So it's very much not a self-seeking enterprise. And there's an interesting book, which I don't have time to talk about, Robert Pennock, philosopher of science, who did a whole lot of empirical work on what virtues scientists value among their peers. And that's worth a look. Actually, I emailed Pennock. If I remember, I'll tell you about the fallout here for this project. So here's the account of science pulled out of that. Science is a growing cooperative mode of life aimed at an ideal fundamental good or object of desire. What's that object of desire? It's truth, okay? Whose exemplary practitioners, not the real people in the street. Exemplary practitioners are animated by a desire to find out the truth, and with that animating spirit comes various distinct virtues. So we've got the desire for truth, curiosity, honesty, and the other directed attitude. And so my thought was, well, let's just pull out a general definition of practices from that, which is clearly his definition of science as a practice. Let's pull out a general definition of practices and apply art. So what's art? On the same model. A cooperative mode of life aimed at an ideal good. This time it's an aesthetic good, not a, drawing a blank on the adjective for truth, not a truthy good, whose exemplary practitioner's animating spirit is a desire to realize the aesthetic good. So does everybody see how this maps onto the definition of truth? Instead of truth, we've got aesthetic good. It's still cooperative. We're still defining in terms of exemplary practitioners, and we've still got virtues. So this raises questions. What's the aesthetic good? And how is it that art is fundamentally cooperative? But, previous question, as I mentioned, this is going to be merely a historical matter if this view of practices is not intrinsically philosophically interesting. It'll just be a piece of Peircean history. So I want to ask now, is this view about practices at all plausible? So far so good? So I want to say yes. I want to say yes, it is. I want to give you three different kinds of considerations that favor the view that this is a view of practices that's independently plausible enough to take seriously. So three kinds of considerations in favor. I want to mention something with regard to a big historic problem in the philosophy of science. I want to mention an ethics parallel, and then I'll mention an aesthetics parallel. So I'm trying to make out the case that this is independently plausible as a view of practices as characterized by the animating spirit of the ideal practitioner.
If you do it from farther away, it will respond.
Say it again?
If you do it from farther away, it will respond.
Okay, I've got a very primitive physics. And if you got questions, just stop me. So here's on the first point. The question is, in the philosophy of sciences, how do we tell the difference between pseudoscience and real science? The thought is you could characterize them in terms of the products of science, in terms of the processes of science. Those are standard ways. Peirce would say neither of those is going to work. Why? Because a lot of the products of science are false. A lot of the methods are no good in the history of science. So he says, I'm going to focus on the practitioners and their animating spirit. And the philosopher of science, James Ladyman, in an interesting paper, argues that the best way to understand the demarcation between science and pseudoscience is in terms of what Harry Frankfurt called bullshit. You guys familiar with this? Okay, so the liar cares about truth. He wants his victim not to believe it. The scientist cares about truth, really wants it. The bullshitter is indifferent to truth. Will say whatever needs to be said for his or her purposes, but truth doesn't enter into the matter except instrumentally or accidentally. So the main claim is pseudoscience is to scientific fraud as bullshit is to lies. Everybody with me here? And the thought is, gosh, that sounds like an animating spirit to me. The animating spirit of bullshit is different from the animating spirit of truth-seeking. And he's characterizing pseudoscience in terms of bullshit, therefore in terms of its animating spirit. So it looks to me like this is a cousin of Peirce's view. He's characterizing science in terms of the spirit that animates it. Why? Because the pseudoscientist is animated by the wrong spirit, and science is what's not pseudoscience. So that's the first point in favor of this.
Can I make a comment?
No. Yeah.
Now, it starts to sound like virtue epistemology before the,
You are
the thing.
I hate to say something good about you, but yes, and another spin-off of this is I've sometimes framed this in my own mind as a virtue theory of art, essentially, and then built up by those means. So yeah, absolutely, it's huge. I'll say a little bit about habit later, and that's I'll skip this, but basically, Ladyman gets cold feet, and he says, well, I know I just said it was about pseudoscience, but then he says, well, but I don't want to say that science is defined in terms of the ideal scientific mind. But then he, I think, says things that mean that he really does. He is committed to the ideal scientific mind, because you're going to have to characterize the emergent properties of the scientific community in terms of the motivations of the practitioners, and that looks to me like it's virtually the animating spirit. So I think he just, I don't know why, just gets cold feet. Second point in favor of taking this seriously as a method, as a way of thinking about practices, I've been at Oxford for 6 months, and by happy coincidence, James Grant is there, who is a very good esthetician, but has recently written a paper about moral worth. And you see the examples here. Take the judge who passes the right sentence for the right reasons, but does so with pleasure because she likes punishing criminals. Right action, wrong spirit. The point is, the spirit with which you do something can bear on the moral worth of your action. So that looks like a direct parallel to Peirce. Peirce says, good method, bad spirit, that detracts from your scientific worth. Bad method, good spirit, we can't quite call you a scientist, but you deserve an honorary praise in the next room, or something like that. Are you with me here? It's not irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. It's not like you're as far away as anybody could be. You're in the neighborhood.
May I?
No. Yes.
Well, when I did the work on Peirce, my point was to investigate the community, the idea of ideal community.
Right.
And I couldn't get to a clear conclusion whether it's more regulatory or constitutive.
Right.
But here it seems that Kant is a very influential presence.
Absolutely.
Peirce.
Yeah.
Hypothetical versus categorical seems to be what's at stake here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you agree that
I agree.
Kant is a...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and more to come. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. So does everybody see the point here? We've got a parallel between moral worth and scientific worth. In each case, it seems like the spirit matters. So I'm trying to make out the claim that this animating spirit can do some real philosophical work. Third case, these aestheticians argue that for every artwork there has to be an aesthetic concept such that the employment of that concept is constitutive of the production. So if that were true, they say, we'd expect aesthetic concepts to play a big role in the training of artists. And that's what we do find, they say. That's what we do find. It turns out that if you look at the expertise literature, artistic expertise literature, expert artists have these kinds of traits: the ability to reliably imbue objects with aesthetic properties, the capacity to discover novel relationships between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties. So that's what we predict if these concepts play a role for them. Are you with me here? So far, does this make sense? Okay, so what's the Peircean take on this going to be? Can you hazard a guess?
Action?
Action, good. Can you say more?
Consequences in terms of what the subject will be doing and how he will be doing it.
I like the last part especially. How he will be doing it. Yeah, what's left out? What would be left out here, given what I've in this?
Animated by the spirit of the
Yeah, what's animating these? What's animating these people? Do they actually care about these properties, or they just happen to be good at it as a technical ability? Are you with me here? Where he is, this is just too behavioristic. There's no account of why anybody. I mean, surely what motivates these folks is not just that they can do this kind of thing, but they really like doing this kind of thing. It really drives them. That's my thought as to the.
And that was Engel's point of a value-driven theory. Sorry.
Is that right?
Yeah. The thing that you got to put value in there. If you don't do that, you get a behavioristic nutshell, empty nutshell.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. Thank you, Nick Samuel. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So So I think the spirit is missing there, and that's a defect in this view. All right then. So what I've just tried to do is to say this view of practice as characterized by the animating spirit of the ideal practitioners is plausible enough to take seriously. So let's go to the actual art case. What's the aesthetic perspective? Well, Peirce says that's what we take when we consider anything without regard to any ulterior considerations of utility, interest, morality, or truth. That looks like it's straight out of the third critique, the critique of judgment. That looks like a straight Kantian characterization. Now the funny thing is we don't know whether Peirce read the third critique. We know he read the first critique really, really, really carefully. But we don't know, there's no direct evidence that he read the critique of judgment. So that's the aesthetic perspective. It's very Kantian. Now here's the aesthetic good. Aesthetic good and evil are closely akin to pleasure and pain. They're what would be pleasurable or painful to the fully developed Superman, the sufficiently mature agent. Okay, so what does he mean by pleasure and pain? Pleasure and pain are second order feelings. They're feelings whose subject matter is other feelings. They attach themselves to other feelings. So the feeling of pain is a symptom of a feeling that attracts us to something, and the feeling of pleasure is a symptom of a feeling that attracts us.
Do you think Peirce read Bishop Butler and his solution to the problem of hedonism?
I think he probably did. It's also clearly Kant's view in the third critique. This is Kant's view of pleasure and pain too. So the thought is, we see something, we experience it just in its thisness. If it attracts us, we feel sympathy, and then a symptom of that feeling of sympathy is pleasure. Or if it repels us, we feel anti-sympathy, and a symptom of that feeling of anti-sympathy is pain. So we then go on to infer, on the basis of that pleasure and pain, that the object in its thisness, its immediate presence, has a pleasing magnetic attraction. And that's beauty. That's the aesthetic good. And the thought is, and he as much as says this, attraction and repulsion are volitional. They have to do with action, at least incipiently. So it can hook up, as he wants it to, with experimental consequences. So we can see somebody when somebody's attracted to something. We can see when somebody's repelled by something. People stop looking. They turn away. Or not. So I mentioned truth earlier to try to illustrate the pragmatic maxim. Truth is defined in terms of the ideal and community of inquiry. So I hope you can see that this is the same picture with regard to aesthetic goodness. We're now defining aesthetic goodness in terms of an ideal. It's the ideal sensibility of a fully affectively mature agent. So ideal community of inquiry, the fully mature agent, they're playing the same role. The first vis-a-vis truth, the second vis-a-vis beauty. Make sense? Okay. And so you smart people who pointed this out, that sounds a lot like what Hume thinks. Hume says that the standard of taste is the joint agreement or verdict of true judges. And then you might wonder, who are true judges anyway? Are there any of them among us? And the answer is maybe, but probably not. They're ideal entities, and so the true judges are, you feel like, family related to the community of inquiry. They're ideal entities. Make sense here so far? So the point is, people take Hume seriously. That should give you a reason to not reject this. I won't go through this here, but I think Peirce's metaphysics is makes way better sense of this than Hume's metaphysics. I won't say that. How do we get to so you might say, this is all fine and good. We've got the sufficiently mature agent, and this is the being who defines the aesthetic good. What's all this about sufficient maturity? So Peirce has an account, a quite elaborate account of affective education, the education of our feelings. And he was strongly influenced by Schiller, and it's basically analogous to a process of moral development, the development of moral virtue. You can develop affective virtues in the same way. What do you do when you want to develop a new habit? You frame a conception of the way you'd like it to be, and then you use that to try to guide your action. To the extent that you like the way your action comes out, you stick with that conception of the ideal. To the extent that you don't like the way your action comes out, you modify your ideal. You continue that process. So the thought is, that's what's going on with habits of feeling, and habits of feeling are what makes for the sufficiently mature agent. And I think it's an interesting point that the process of self-development or self-training involves the production of these ideals, which are essentially self-portraits. And so that's their creation involves aesthetic judgment. You're creating a sort of idealized self-portrait of yourself and saying, I want to be this person. I want to live in accord with this. And so Peirce's thought is these ideals are treated as abductions, as hypotheses. We try to live in accord with them, and we stick with them to the extent that we like the results, and don't stick with them to the extent that we don't. The thought is, this is how we can improve habits of feeling. And then the thought is, this is how one could get to a more mature agent. And so this is how one could get to something approaching the ideal of the sufficiently mature agent, which is what gives us our account of aesthetic goodness. We okay here?
So another author, he's anticipating his roles.
Yeah.
The reflective equilibrium.
Yes. There's puzzle. Yes, there's puzzles in here that I'm not going to mention, but yeah. I mean, briefly, the puzzle is with the account of truth, we've got at least the hope that there is such a thing as reality, which is independent of our investigation. But the question is there anything analogous to that in this case? Right?
Yes.
I'll
ask you.
Okay.
After you present.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good. And I can work this out in more detail, but there are more clear Kantian resonances here, and I'll skip those. So I've tried to justify the claim that the animating spirit of the community makes a difference. It makes a difference, and it's not an impulsive view. I've just sketched the view of the aesthetic good. I've just sketched the fully mature agent, which is part of what you need for the aesthetic good. The animating spirit is aimed at realizing the aesthetic good. That's why we care about that. In the scientific case, the practice is a communal mode of life. And so the question is that the case with art? Does the parallel extend that far? And this is really quite speculative. But I want to try to now make the case that the practice of art is essentially communal in two ways. And you'll recognize this view. Here's my take, and I'm not. This is speculative. An artist experiences an interesting feeling. Interesting is an aesthetic predicate, and they want to understand that feeling. It doesn't just come complete. So what they do is they try to embody that feeling in a medium, and that could be something done internally or something external. In embodying it, they're interpreting it. So there's the possibility that they may have clarified the feeling by producing an embodiment. And then the process is experimental, basically. I think I did a good, now I contemplate the embodiment I've created, internally or externally. Do I think I captured what I was after? If so, I'm done. If not, I modify and continue the process. Interesting point, I think, and he doesn't come out and say this, but it seems right to me. And there's interesting stuff on the phenomenology of math about this, actually. Very interesting paper by this guy, Christopher Wenzel, on the art of mathematics. The point is, having embodied a feeling in some medium, you might try to tweak what you've produced because you think your embodiment more or less successfully embodies the feeling. But you might just get really interested in what you've produced for its own sake as a medium, and then you might start tweaking it from that perspective. So you may well be moving back and forth between this sort of internal and external perspective on the thing you made. To me, that seems phenomenologically right, that it's not a pure, I'm trying to embody a feeling project. It's a back and forth between a, gosh, here's this interesting thing I've produced, and maybe I can make it more interesting by doing this. And so, obviously, definitively at the end of the process, the artist thinks, okay, I got something aesthetically good. Okay. And I can draw a conclusion. This is for the Peirce people, the aesthetic goodness of the concept is, the object is more intense than that one, that other one. So I'm trying to make out the communal nature of this. What makes this a communal process? Two points. The first one is that this is essentially a semiotic process. I'm producing a sign of something, and then I'm producing later signs of that sign and later signs of that sign. Peirce's view is that the semiotic process is essentially dialogical. It's a dialogue between your present self and your future self. I made this, now I want to look at it and see what I think about it, or listen to it and hear what I think about it. So, to the extent that it's a semiotic process, the process has a communal nature. That's the kind of cheap point. More interesting, or more substantive point, he clearly does think that most of our feelings and emotions are shared by others in the community to a greater or lesser extent. And so when the artist is trying to interpret or embody a feeling of hers, she's trying to interpret or embody or express a feeling that's around in the community. And so to that extent, whether she succeeds or not can be tested by how the audience receives the attempt. Is this the way I feel? And so nobody mentioned Hollywood, but here I am mentioning Hollywood. Artists have always been in the habit of treating the public as collaborators. So I don't know how I feel until I see what I've made. And I don't know how I feel until I see what you make of what I made. Because that's how we feel. So that's the claim there is that's what makes this communal. And that's very Collingwoodian, and I'm not. That seems like a reasonable hypothesis. Let's put it that way. All right. Last thing I want to do is to try to connect this with some contemporary definitions of art. And some of you have read some, and only some of you have read some of these definitions of art, or at least he's talked to you about them, whether you did the reading or not. So Gerald Levinson, Noel Carroll, Robert Stecker, with a slight qualification, are all committed to the view that art does not have intrinsic properties. The only way that something can be art is in virtue of some relation that it stands into some preceding art. So they're not intrinsic properties, they're historical properties. And the puzzle is, well, if art can only be defined historically, then history goes back a long way. How do we figure out historical connectedness does not seem to be enough to preserve identity. After all, think about the motivations of computational astrophysicists. Those are historically related to the motivations of pre-humans trying to attract mates. But we want to say that those are the same motivations. Mere historical connectedness doesn't seem like it's enough. We're related to a bunch of pre-humans. That doesn't make us pre-humans. The point is, we need to preserve a distinction between a practice changing and a practice ending. Are you with me here? The Australopithecines came to an end. So the question for historical definitions of art is, all right, if you want to define art in terms of historical relations, which historical relations preserve the identity of art? Aren't there some historical changes which could bring about the end of art? Are you with me here? So I now present to you a little bit more detail on this. To take the view of Noel Carroll as an example, he says something is an artwork if it was created by an artist in an artistic context with a recognized artistic motivation, and as a result of being so created, stands in the right relation to at least one acknowledged artwork. We've got nothing intrinsic about art, right? We've just got motivation, that's artistic, artist, artistic context. So the question is, okay, what's an artistic motivation? This is clearly circular, right? It's clearly lacks any content, unless we know something about what it is to be an art context or an artist or an art motivation. So he breaks out of the circle by saying, well, motivation is artistic if it's the motivation to repudiate, amplify, or repeat something in the tradition. And then what does it mean to repudiate the tradition? To reject something along some dimensions where that goes along with maintaining contact with other dimensions. So far, so good? Fair enough? Okay. So I think that won't work. And here's a reductio argument to show that that won't work. The view that's analogous to historical narrativism, let's call it blue tile making historical narrativism. This is the definition of blue tile making as a practice. What does that view say? It says that blue tiles are things created by a blue tile maker in a blue tile making context with a recognized and live blue tile making motivation. So we've got the parallel here. Everybody with me here? So I try to show this won't work, why not? Well, the blue tile making tradition has several dimensions. There's the hue focused dimension, the saturation focused dimension, the brightness focused dimension. You might repudiate, amplify, and repeat, and by doing so, repudiate tiles along the hue dimension while staying in contact with the saturation dimension and the brightness dimension. Keep that up long enough, and the practice will evolve into the practice of making green tiles. Keep going, it'll evolve into the practice of making red tiles. We're just staying in contact with the saturation and brightness dimensions, but losing contact with the hue dimension. But now consider the tiles have lots of dimensions, physical dimensions. And those can be repudiated, amplified, and so we can leave tiles behind too. The point is, what's the point?
The empty nutshell. There's something inside.
The empty nutshell. The blue tile making tradition can turn into a tradition of absolutely anything. Absolutely anything. That's absurd, I say. I say, we have to say that if it turns into there's some kind of things that can turn into, it's not the blue tile making tradition anymore. We could even use those words, blue tile making tradition, but that wouldn't make it the same tradition. It wouldn't make it the same tradition. Well, analogy or parallel or isomorphism or whatever you want to call it here, artworks have multiple dimensions as well. Aesthetic dimension, moral dimension, economic dimension, political dimension. By the same argument, you can get an artistic, by repeated RARing, you can get an artistic tradition to turn into any kind of tradition you like.
And if you consider that nobody is in agreement about what aesthetic actually means.
Well, that's another problem. If the parallel works, then art traditions cannot die. They're immortal. Because whatever they turn into, they're still art traditions. To me, that seems absurd. To me, it seems like we have to be able to draw that distinction. Okay, well, why am I going on about this? What am I going to say next?
By now, for me, what I understood is that you don't think that tradition or practice as a ground to say what art is enough. Because it can change so much, and with this criterion, every change is plausible or possible, and it can go anywhere, so it has no definition at all.
Good.
Not if you're a Hegelian.
Okay.
Which person?
Okay.
What lacks here is maybe the animated spirit.
Bingo. That's bingo.
Yeah.
That bingo. That's the right. That's the thought. Thank you. Good. Right.
Something that we loosely recognize, but and we know that drives us to making art.
Good. Right. Good.
All these definitions, they want to define the subject, by bypassing the aesthetic good.
Right, exactly right, exactly right.
Okay.
Right.
And,
Yep.
no, it's empty. You cannot do that.
Right. Yes, good, exactly right. And so this is probably overkill, but I think there's stuff about repudiating, amplifying, and repeating can't work because it's just too generic. You can repudiate, amplify, and repeat things with all kinds of different spirits, right? You could do it in a scientific spirit, in a legal spirit, in a religious spirit, in a moral spirit, in an economic spirit. But every practice has got multiple dimensions as well. So just RARing things doesn't preserve the animating spirit. What matters is what's the animating spirit with which you're repudiating things. Are you with me here? So if this is correct, if what I've said is correct, then none of these views, all these views are going to face the same problem. A purely historical conception is going to be open to a reductio of this kind. So, for example, Robert Stecker has a definition of art, and it's essential to his definition of art that he say what an art function is. And so then the question is, well, what makes a function an art function? Like, if we come across a new function, what makes it an art function? And his answer is, well, Noel Carroll has said some really interesting things about this. In other words, RARing, that's his answer. The answer to the question, what preserves art functionness, is this same story that I was just attacking. So I think the Levinson view, the Carroll view, other people who defended historical views, the Stecker view, none of them are going to avoid this problem, I think. You need something to do some more work than just history.
It's not just the historical view, because if you take other relational views that are not historical, but like the institutional view, trying to define, again, bypassing the aesthetic good, you have all these structured Dickey's, the circle of art thing, okay, but how do you distinguish all this apparatus from a different practice with a similar apparatus?
Absolutely right.
You cannot understand that.
Absolutely right. I mean, if you think about that Carroll definition, it's super Dickeyan. I mean, he was Dickey's student, right? But you've got these, the art public, the art world, this circle of art concepts, and nothing but an art concept in there. Yeah.
You can go two ways with a strategy like this. You can be like Berkeley, George Berkeley, Bishop, who said experience is just what's been experienced. So art is what's been art. And you can go Hegelian and say everything that has ever been done is approaching aesthetic good, aesthetic good.
Right.
So you have history or experience doing all the work.
Right. Well, can you say more about history or experience doing all the work?
Well,
because it's not just it's a certain...
You don't need to have something beyond, in Berkeley's case, your sensations of pleasure or pain. To have an experience. You don't need matter. Matter can be put to the side. So there's no separate thing from experience, which is the cause of your experience, or which is what your experience is about.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the. I mean, I think you probably have something to say about the seven persons relationship to Hegel is really sort of I think he had a kind of love-hate relationship with Hegel. I haven't thought enough about how to put this together with the Hegel stuff.
For me, it's very hard too, because that's what got me stuck when I wrote first. I couldn't really decide to what extent things like ideal community, motivating spirit, etc., are Hegelian or not. Because if they are, then idealist must be taken in a very strict sense, just as Hegel takes it as the absolute. But if you're an empiricist, and I think Peircean is also an empiricist, then you never get to the absolute. And you can be like Kant and say this is just a regulative ideal.
Right. Yeah.
And those are two very different ways to go.
Yeah. I think it's a regulative for Peirce. I mean that's.
Hegel.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. Okay.
That inkling.
Okay.
But again, he was called the Hume Redivivus.
Right.
Because he is so similar to Hume at the same time.
Yeah. Although I skipped over it, but the ideal, what's the status of the ideal judges, right? Like Hume's a nominalist, he's a fictionalist of some kind, I think. I mean, this is just, I mean, Peirce has got a really robust metaphysics. So he thinks that ideals are real, but they don't exist. And the distinction between what's real and what exists is, so things that exist can affect and be affected by other things. So this exists. But to be real is just to be the way it is, independent of our representations of it. So, for example, a law of nature is real. Why? Because in the final opinion, when the final opinion of inquiry, they're going to say, yeah, there are laws of nature. So far, so good. Whatever they believe is true, and whatever is represented in a true belief is real. So far, so good. So the laws of nature are real, but the laws of nature don't exist. Right? The laws of nature are not things that we can come across in the world. They bear some relation to the world, but they can't be affected. So I think Peirce thinks that ideals are real, but don't exist. But to exist is not the best thing there is. I mean, we've kind of already said this, but the thought is that if you get the animating spirit in there, that preserves identity in a way that you can't preserve it without the animating spirit. And so you might think this stuff about the spirit is all just kind of airy-fairy, but Peirce thinks that communities are something like persons, basically. The difference between an individual, I mean, he says there's no fundamental difference between a community and an individual vis-a-vis their personhood. And so it seems to me that if you thought about personal identity in terms of animating spirit, that's not a crazy view at all. If you think about scientific cases where here's somebody, as a result in a thought experiment, is this person the same person as the person earlier? Do the beliefs matter so much? No, maybe not. Does the physical stuff matter so much? No, maybe not. Does the animating spirit of this being matter? Yeah, it matters a lot. I think this is the same person or this is not the same person, even though other stuff changes. So that's just an indication, kind of a gesture at the thought that this is not an implausible view for personhood. And so we ought not to take it to be an implausible view for a practice or a mode of life or a community.
You also have these discussions in social epistemology, whether groups can have epistemic states that don't match the individual components of states. So you could you have summativist positions, anti-summativist positions. We have a colleague here still studying that kind of stuff. Maybe that could map onto the...
Yeah, and he definitely thinks that. I mean, he thinks the scientific community can have beliefs. There's no question about that he thinks that the main belief holder is the community. When it comes to science, there's your beliefs and my beliefs, but they're not identical with what the community thinks. So yeah, he's that's another direction to go here. And I realized when I get here that this version of these slides, I didn't say anything about the natural kinds, which I think I threatened to say something about. So I could say something about that if you like, or not, or you guys can.
The problem for me, it's not a problem. I'm trying to understand this possibility of, is it possible to, it's not define, but at least to determine better what exactly is the specific animating spirit of art as a practice, and not of other things like science.
Good. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. That's no. Great. I mean, great question. So I think just to work the analogy, truth is what the scientific community wants. Peirce is ambivalent about the word beauty. He actually talks more about aesthetic goodness, but he talks some about beauty. But so in the scientific community, what we really want, and what we want to realize is the truth. In a moral community, what we really want and want to realize is the moral good. Mm-hmm. So far, so good. In the aesthetic or artistic community, what we want or really want, what trumps everything, is the aesthetic good. That's the thought. So considerations of truth and morality can come in, but they're not the focus.
Mm-hmm.
How do you recognize? How does an agent or a person recognize that his motivation is tracking the right things, the good or the true or the
right? Right. Yeah. Great question. I think it's.
How do you recognize what you're after?
I think he thinks that our conception of the aesthetic good is growing, and through our activity, we're getting a better fix on the nature of the aesthetic good. It's not a fixed static thing. And so that's this, what I was trying to refer to earlier, it's this tricky thing about truth, where the truth is.
But doesn't it collide with that disposition of the scientist to ditch everything he believes if something truer comes along? How do you reconcile those two?
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, good question. So here's one thing I could say about that. It may be that he's really trying to ramp up the purity of these scientific motives, right? He's really trying to make it, like he says, you got to be ready to dump all your beliefs if they're wrong. And then he says, this is sublime. Like this is, in other words, this is this unbelievable moral demand. Maybe that's a little bit rhetorical. Maybe what he really should say is, I mean, in a way, what he's trying to do is to sell you the scientific worldview. He's trying to say, this is beautiful. This is a way we should admire this. Maybe a more nuanced thing that he could say would be, well, your theories aren't completely wrong. They're largely wrong, or they're wrong to a certain degree, and so the same story would be with the aesthetic, I think. Like, I'm not sure whether that can be made out, but you understand what I'm saying?
But do you think that? Sorry, go ahead. No.
Wouldn't it be possible for someone aesthetically also having these aesthetic jumps? Like now, my pursuit of the aesthetic good changed the way I relate to things, or I give value to things,
right,
because something happened to me and I discovered something. Or wouldn't it be possible to, like in science with?
It is possible. So I think I can answer part of that, but I'm not sure what's going to answer what you're.
Well, I was going to say that's the main problem for me with Peirce's position. It's the thing with hypothesis. How do you get the right hypothesis to answer or start answering, start an investigation into the nature of truth?
But he's got a line about that. I don't know whether you buy it or not. I mean, I'll tell you what the line.
He says it's something like Nietzschean, like the harmony of nature. We have an affinity.
Right.
With nature.
Right.
That's a bit.
No, I don't think that's so. No, I don't think that's so. I don't think that's so bad. I mean,
like the Kantian genius, no?
The Kantian.
Yeah.
Genius of Kant.
Well, he's a romantic, so maybe.
Well, there is that, but I think I would give that argument more credit. What he says is, take any phenomenon that we need an explanation for. There's a zillion possible hypotheses. There are absolutely a zillion. But you know what? We don't go through a zillion of them. We get the hypothesis, we get the right one pretty darn quickly, pretty surprisingly. Science hasn't been around that long. We've made a whole lot of progress. So he says, it's got to be that we're in some way we've got some ability that lets us make hypotheses at a rate better than chance would predict. And so that seems like a reasonable move to me, and there are evolutionary reasons for that, right?
Yes,
like if we were being
take an evolutionary stance, it
Yeah.
makes sense.
right. Well, I think he'd be fine with that. I mean, we're
But-
never going to get out of
But
the.
if you introduce the ideal into the
Yeah.
mix, where does it live? It because evolutionary biology is not teleological, so the ideal would never come in.
I agree with that. But I don't see why it matters.
It matters because we are tending towards the ideal. That's where we are aiming at. So our
Right.
hypothesis might be natural to us because we have the nature that we have, and they have been successful
Right.
for us.
Right.
Being successful for us is the same thing as being ideally true in the long run.
No, but it will converge on it. It will. I mean, it's a step it's a step in the right direction. I mean, he thinks it's a hope that we're going to get to the truth. We don't know that we are.
That's the aspect, the hope,
Right.
that I think is it's not justified.
Well, so you won't like this either, but he says a person would have to be completely crazy to think that science has not made actual discoveries.
Well, Schopenhauer also says solipsism is so crazy, you have to be crazy to believe it, so I will give no argument for it. So if you don't give arguments for X, then you just say you have to be crazy.
Oh.
Then we
Well,
must
yeah. So although I mean, Peirce has this other idea. Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts. So he's not trying to answer everybody, I think. I mean, if you're a complete skeptic about science, I don't think he's going to try to convince that person.
I don't have to be a complete skeptic. I can simply have no hope of ever getting to anything called ideal or truth. Because like Bishop Berkeley says, what is science? He has an instrumentalist view of science. It's what works.
Yeah, but the person.
And that's very in the evolutionary
Right.
spirit.
But yeah, you don't. So you're not sympathetic to the. I mean, an explanation is needed for why it works. That's what's wrong with instrumentalism. It's not a brute fact that things work. There's got to be an explanation for why they work. And so the hypothesis is there's something independent of our inquiry on which our inquiry could be. I mean, that's explanatorily more powerful than it just works. End of story.
Of course, but that's taken on faith, and that's Hume's point. Hume makes a joke about there being a universal harmony. Because we have no experience of universal harmony. We just expect it to be there. Or you use universal harmony as short for I don't know.
Yeah, I think what Peirce thinks is I'm justified in this hope. I'm not claiming to know. I'm certainly not claiming to know with certainty. I'm claiming to be justified to hope. And so leave me alone. Let me do my thing. I don't mean you, right? So this is my hope. We'll see how it pans out. It's a rational hope.
That's Kant again.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I think Peirce is clearly on that page. It's a rational hope. We're justified in this hope. We're not claiming belief. We're not claiming knowledge.
Don't you think it's very funny in the laughing sense of the word? Hume says, so our reason doesn't do much for us, but we trust whatever instincts we have to generalize. And then Kant comes along and says, no. Objectivity is a rational interest. To be rational is to believe objectivity exists. That's definitional, isn't it? How does he get to say which interests are reason's interests and which results are the rational ones? Well, sorry. I'll leave it alone.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. I don't. I to me the instrumentalism is just a complete
Well, because
dead
the
end.
problem here is in the beginning you said, Peirce has a way to escape a definition that is all about words. And what I'm saying is that maybe not.
I mean, it does seem like you break out of the circle of words.
The veil of ideas, you think so?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you've just gotta, there is merely hope here. And so, it takes a lot less to justify a hope than it does to justify a belief. I mean, this is Kant, right? And a lot less to justify a belief than to justify a claim to certainty. And so all he wants, this is the way I would read it, all he wants to do is to kind of like get himself off the hook as far as criticism goes. And so if I've got a hypothesis here that is as hypothesis acceptable, and then I can generate some testable consequences, that's good enough for me. I don't claim to get more than that. That's sort of part of my.
That's a good answer.
Are you with me there?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I like you more than I did a couple minutes ago. I think he's really got I think he's really trying to prune down the expectations and say, look, don't be insane. I know this is a really hard problem. I'm trying to make a pretty modest claim here, and if I can make that out, then that's something. That's not nothing. That's not skepticism. I mean, he says fallibilism is separated from skepticism by the breadth of a hair. Right. It's not skepticism, but it's really, 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 it's close, but it's not. And that difference makes all the difference.
Can I make a question?
Please, yeah, go.
It's completely different. But I don't know Peirce's full argument, but I think it's much easier to buy that scientific practices as a unique aim, like truth,
Okay.
as you said,
Okay.
than it is to accept that every other practice says an aim or an
Yeah.
objective,
Yeah.
including the artistic practices.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
for me, the establishment of an aesthetic good is it's not as easier for me to buy as it is truth in science or
Yeah.
truth or anything close to truth.
Yeah.
As it was discussed.
Yeah.
Couldn't that be questionable or at least?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I'm not committed to saying that every practice has a single good. But then the question is whether there are.
Practice as a,
Yeah, and so that I'm not going to be able to say anything very satisfying to that. But I think, my kind of naive question is, if a practice doesn't have an aesthetic good as the object of desire, what makes it an artistic practice? I always worry about drift there. The other thing I could. Do you want to say? Did you want to?
No, I completely agree with you. I think that's the biggest objection to my question. It's the thing you just said.
Okay. Okay.
I completely.
The other thing he says, I actually opened up the wrong file here, so I gave you guys the wrong talk. Sorry.
I did.
You did? Okay. Well, this was too much more. Well, there were some slides about Peirce on natural kinds, so I can say a little bit of. I can do that. Yeah, it's probably better to read my words than listen to my talk. Richard Boyd, this philosopher of science, has this view that well, maybe I'll just talk about the Peirce view. That doesn't matter. But this is the influential view about the nature of natural kinds. I'll say a little bit about it. He thinks so. What natural kinds are clusters of properties. They're not sharp, mathematically defined kinds. They've got blurry edges by nature, and so there's degrees of natural kindness, and there's no. Well, let leave it at that.
Kinds like genus and species in biology.
Yeah. Like Boyd started out thinking about biology because the thing about biological kinds is they change, right? Species evolve, but you don't want to say. It's the same story here. You don't want to say that a species can evolve into absolutely anything and remain the same species. At a certain point, you get a new species. But the question is, if you define it historically only, how do you do that, right? Because we're related back to a lot of really, really simple stuff. So what Boyd is trying to give is an account of natural kinds which permits them to change. And so the properties in a natural kind stand in this homeostatic relationship to each other where they maintain the identity of the thing, but there can be change over time. So I didn't realize, Peirce read this historian of philosophy, philosopher, historian of science, Whewell, very carefully. And there's this really interesting guy. He had a cluster view of natural kinds. It was a going view in early biology. And so this idea that natural kinds have necessary and sufficient conditions, according to some scholars, this is complete anachronism. That the history of thinking about kinds is way more in terms of these looser entities. Okay, so Peirce puts a spin on this. Peirce read Whewell really carefully. Peirce thinks that there are what he calls purposive natural classes. And who asked about virtues early in the paper? Somebody said something about virtues. So a huge concept. A huge concept for Peirce is the concept of a habit, and a habit is essentially a virtue. And so purposes are habits, and habits are statistical. So they're not deterministic, heading towards a predefined end state, and habits leave open a lot of things. If I've got a habit of smoking, that doesn't determine how much I smoke, what brand I smoke, how often I smoke, where I smoke. It leaves a lot of things open, and habits can change. Okay, so far so good. That's all good enough. But this is to come to your question. In natural classes, you've got main purposes, and then you've got subsidiary purposes, and so those all interact with each other. And so, because they do that, that's why you don't get necessary sufficient conditions for kinds. You just get clusters because you've got these different habits operating, right? So his example is lamps. Well, there's a bunch. What do you want if you make a lamp? You want illumination, but you've got a bunch of other purposes. I can't go broke. I want it to look okay. I don't want it to set the house on fire. So given those things, Peirce thinks, we're going to get cases where purposive classes overlap. And so that's sweet from my perspective, because that, you might say, that's what's going on with art. We've got a bunch of subsidiary purposes in art. I'm not just trying to realize the aesthetic good, but I'm trying to make a moral point. I'm trying to grind some political axe. I'm trying to impress, my buddies. I might have converted, I got to make money. So as a consequence, and he says this right out, and characteristically works through a archaeological example to show that this is true, with a whole bunch of error theory in it. But so you'd expect that classes like art and propaganda and other things are going to overlap. That's fully compatible with the reality of those classes. And so he thinks, if you have sharp edges in a class, that's a sign of its lack of reality. That's a sign that what you're talking about is something that's purely a function of our representations, or is a matter of representation. So why are mathematical definitions nice and sharp? Because there are free creations. That's why they're totally a matter of representation. Whereas the world is messy. So I'm trying to say maybe that's a way to go with this multiple.
Yeah, that makes much more sense to me.
Okay.
But there has to be a main purpose, right? There still is a main purpose.
Yeah, good question. I think so, but I can't give you I have to think more about trying to give you an answer.
Yeah, I was just follow up on this.
You can answer for me? Are you going to give a good answer or a bad answer?
Whatever answer you throw it at me. Well, just make it clear, because we don't know empirically, psychologically, anything about the artists. We have no idea what motivates them to do whatever they do. So when you talk about animating spirit being X, you are talking from the point of view of the interpreter. The interpreter recognizes in the object something that would have been the main purpose of the artist when making the object. Is that it?
I'm not sure. I think we are capable of identifying the spirit that animates people. Do you doubt that? Fallibly.
In contemporary art, yes. If they don't explain to us what they're doing, we don't see anything.
Well,
It's like those zillion hypotheses, but we're not going to go through all of them. And why don't we go through all of them? The same with what's the animating spirit, what's the point? What was the if you think about the artist's motivation, the effective motivation, it's a more intentionalistic way of framing it than what's the point of the work. So there's got to be an explanation for why it works. So there's a very conspicuous point to this artwork. There's got to be an explanation for that. And for there to be a symmetry between the artist's motivation and the point, as I see it, it's a good explanation. It's as good as it gets. So. No.
Is that an answer to her?
No,
I don't know. I
actually,
just sprang to mind.
I think it's the same thing that I was trying to say.
I'm sorry. I'm just being slow here. Is this skepticism about the ability to identify the?
Sorry, I'm not a skeptic.
Well, is the question?
I don't think Peirce is very close to Hume, much more than he would like, and he himself recognizes that. But what I was saying is, Victor said now as well, is that there's something about the work that makes us recognize it as a work of art and purpose from the point of view of the artist is. If all you mean by that is intention, then it's not very illuminating. There has to be a way of purpose showing in the work, being salient, as he said in the work, that works for everyone contemplating that work, or would work for everyone.
Well, I don't know about everyone. Everyone?
For the ideal contemplator.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I don't agree that it makes the intention. I'm just not tracking this exactly. I don't agree that it makes the intent. I mean, I agree that there's various ways we figure out what animates things. It's not like we've got some kind of intuition into nothing like that, obviously. So is it a fallible process? Yeah. Does it involve all kinds of inferences? Yeah. Can we ever even know that we get it right? Well, maybe even not, but that's all fine. I mean, I think any more than, it's like the view about truth. Peirce thinks that we do know some truth now. There are some questions on which the community has settled on an answer that will hold up in the final opinion. Are you with me here? So we know things now. It's not that we have to wait until the end of time or the end of the realization of this ideal to know the truth. We know a bunch of truth now. We may not know that we know it, right? There are things that we know now, things that we believe now that will be upheld in the final opinion. So I'm kind of thinking about making that same move there. Although, I don't think I really have to say anything about the meaning of artworks for this to go. I don't think I have to say a whole lot about that. I mean, it can be vague, it can be indeterminate. I don't think that's a problem for the view.
No.
You don't?
I think
Okay.
Also, following on what he said about the main purpose, in the beginning of your presentation, it seemed to me that you focused. I'm not sure if this can be an answer, but you focused on pleasure and pain. Couldn't this be the foundation or the ground for the aesthetic good and for the main purpose we are looking for?
Well, it's tricky. It's a reasonable point, a reasonable question. the thing about it is that he thinks that, so remember, the aesthetic good is what would be pleasure and pain to the fully developed agent. And so it's not a version of hedonism. It's not that, right, it's that we're attracted, and that is what gives rise to pleasure, ultimately. So it's not that we're attracted because it's pleasurable, but the other way around.
Yes.
Right? So, so then you wonder about
secondary feeling, or you said the name like
it's a symptom, secondary feeling, right? Second order feeling, symptom. Yeah. So
that could be important to sorry. When all this got hooked on beauty, I thought, okay, consider some works of art. I don't know, Franz Schaeffer's Messerschmitt's sculptures of grimaces. You know that they are very skillful sculptures of horrible human expressions.
Right.
But what attracts me to that, if not, it's not beauty.
Right.
So
right.
Whatever it attracts me, I mean, it could be something else, like some form of cognitive compensation.
Yeah.
If you go, you think of Matthew Kieran's reply to what is our purpose in enjoying deeply immoral works of art, and he goes, there's a cognitive compensation. This tends to approximate the aesthetic good to the alethic good. Some mode of the. Is it really a distinct thing which is phenomenological, a pleasure, a kind of pleasure, this or that, a tingle? Like Goodman used to play with this, tingle immersion theory. No, it's a mode of the alethic.
Yeah.
But in principle, it could be fitted with all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know whether I made it clear, but Peirce says, well, I don't really want to talk about beauty. That's way too narrow.
Yeah.
He says in something, that's way too narrow a conception. And the other thing he says, which is, there's just very little on his aesthetics. He wrote very little. He got interested at the end of his life. It's worked in with a bunch of other stuff, which is not immediately germane here. But he actually says in one place that we tend to mix up moral considerations with aesthetic considerations. And so he says the badness of a bad person, a criminal, can be aesthetically good, and we think not, because we tend to get confused about the moral dimension of it, or we identify ourselves in some way with things, and this is a psychological disposition of ours. But if you really took a suitably detached view, detached from utility, truth, and morality, then we could see that the villainy of the villain is got a sort of aesthetic purity to it. So he's got that theme too. So what is it that attracts us about this thing, this horrible face? Well, maybe some people, I don't know about the psychology of it, maybe some people are just better at stepping back from a bunch of non-aesthetic stuff than other stuff, and that's what we would think, right? Some people are better at abstracting away from non-aesthetic considerations than others are. I think that would be his.
What would be the non-aesthetic here? Because not ugliness, because that's an aesthetic.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I don't know the case. Maybe if there's an evincing of pain or something like that, so it's some kind of sympathetic, some kind of human sympathetic thing, like we see painful expressions, and that gives rise to a sympathy of something. Maybe I don't know if that, I'm thrashing around here, but if it's just ugliness, then I think, at some places he even says that, he says some hard to understand things about the very possibility of a distinction between aesthetic goodness and badness. And it's not clear that it's consistent with other things, but it might be made consistent by means of this kind of move.
Does pleasure and pain play such a big role in this? Because good art is supposed to make us feel a very wide array of feelings very intensely.
Yeah.
And some of them might be extremely painful.
Yeah, it depends how you make out. I think, good question. I think if one's trying to build in an action component here, one natural thing to say is, do you want to keep experiencing it or not? And that's the volitional component, and that's consistent with a whole lot of complicated experience. I mean, yeah, it makes me, Dostoevsky, it's super hard to read. You just think, oh my God, I can't be in this guy's head anymore. I'm going to go insane if I have to keep thinking like Raskolnikov or somebody like that. But I keep reading, so it's not bliss.
So you're also detached from pleasure and pain.
Or is there some kind of higher order pleasure and pain, right? Like I take a pleasure in the...
I don't buy detachment. You're looking at the disasters of war, by the way. Is that how you appreciate it? Is that what gets you hooked to that? I'm detached. I'm detaching from the fact that they're sawing the guy in half. No, you're not.
But isn't there an element of... You think there's an element of detachment in it? I mean, wouldn't I just be like, blubbering away or throwing up or something if there wasn't some detachment?
Detachment here doesn't mean to be tranquil. I think it means not having a vested interest or
impartial.
or the thing not being seen as useful for somebody else.
Right. Yeah, I think I would try to finesse what that attitude.
Creating a distance, just to be able to look at it, like in Aristotle Poetics.
Yeah, you know it's representation. You know it's representation.
Right.
Something that would disgust you in reality kind of attracts you in representation.
But you don't try to intervene and
like Don Quixote in the play.
Right.
Hume's example.
Right.
But also, I would not go with the idea. I'm appreciating this as if it were an abstract pattern. I'm detaching in that sense, like like I appreciate inorganic nature, like pure form. That's not my approach to the thing.
Yeah.
I know it's a representation. The fact that I know that it's a representation puts this sort of shield between me and, like in the sublime. I'm not worried about being killed by the volcano, so I can appreciate the sublime. And knowing it's a representation introduces, although some people have very extreme reactions to representations of like the Stendhal syndrome and stuff like that. Please.
It's possible to have an aesthetic reaction to real things. For instance, Ernst Junger was a person who wrote a lot about the aesthetics of war. Real war.
Right.
So I think you would be looking at the television today and have lots of aesthetic experience. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So,
The Marinetti Manifesto.
Say it again. That's what I thought. Yeah.
I translated that.
Yeah.
War is a kind of beauty.
Well, right. I mean, war is sublime in the Third Critique, right? I mean, Kant says in the Third Critique, like that's one of the. I think it's. I think you can take an aesthetic perspective on all kinds of things, on anything. I don't know that helps, but yeah, I'm sure that that's his view.
Maybe what we appreciate in war aesthetically is not the suffering per se, or the death per se, or the destruction per se, but the formal aspects of that.
That's interesting. Or maybe the aesthetic features of the moral dimension, as in, I think Robert E. Lee said something like, "It's a good thing that war is so horrible because it's so beautiful," or something like that. Like the heroism can be aesthetically super powerful, even though there's a bunch of horrible stuff that goes along with it. That there's something morally sublime, even if misguided or messed up in other ways. Maybe that's part of what's going on with war, like this unbelievable courage. Say.
There are always photographers trying to take the best war picture, I think it was in the Iraq War that they took one that looked a lot like Michelangelo's Pietà.
Oh, is that right?
And was very famous at the time. So that's...
Yeah, interesting.
I don't know. If you go to a war looking for the pathetic, is that an aesthetic way to go.
Right, right. You're right. I mean, you might think the pathetic has its own aesthetic. The aesthetic of the pathetic.
You can't find seemingly contradictory aesthetic aspects. Just an example. You have seeing ads and representations. A picture of Churchill as a bulldog. That's a kind of import.
Right.
A picture of Churchill as a hawk would have a different import.
Right.
A picture of Churchill as a fox, as a worm, whatever.
Right.
They all convey different perspectives on the same thing.
Right.
But you don't have. It's not a logical. There's no logical inconsistency.
Right.
Reality is rich enough to supply for all those perspectives.
Right.
Yeah, in some aspects he was a bulldog. He was also a hawk, a fox, and worm.
Right.
Like, see?
Right.
Maybe this sort of thing applies to our aesthetic.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Because you have to like the mountains are not sublime like okay, this is blue or this is it reflects light in a certain wavelength.
Yeah.
When I think of the mountains as sublime, it includes my thought that of the relative discrepancy in dimension of the mountains, because the mountains are so huge and I'm so small, so it's included in the thought. So you will have layers of complexity.
Right.
My reactions to my reactions to my like evaluations over evaluations.
Right.
I react to how I responded to this thing.
Right.
Okay? So pleasure in my taking pleasure in my you know what, the aesthetic evaluation will be more about this sort of situation than it reflects light in a certain way. Like it has a certain whatever non-aesthetic property.
Right.
Maybe it's a good moment to end. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the great comments. The comments were just great. So thank you. That was.